All right, good morning. We are going to be talking in this unit about bird song, and hopefully some of this we have already covered in class, and so it will be up to you whether you want to use the first portions that perhaps cover material we've talked about in class as a way of reviewing and gathering additional information, or whether you want to skip forward in the notes to the portions that we didn't get to as part of class this week. Regardless, the function or the objective of this particular unit is to look at birdsong and how they communicate, and more specifically to look at the functions of birdsong as well as the development. What are some of the major steps along the way that take place as birds learn to develop their song? One of the limitations of this particular aspect of a PowerPoint is that a lot of the example songs that I have embedded into the PowerPoint that we will be listening to as part of lecture are not able to be activated within a narrated PowerPoint video. So what I will do is I will post separately on Moodle a lot of these particular examples, and as you get to those points in the lecture in the video, you can go ahead and listen to those files on Moodle. So let's start with a question, and that is the question of why do birds sing, right? So here I've given you four answers or four possibilities. I'd like you to just pause for a moment and consider what you might think is the answer for what is one of the functions, perhaps, of why birds sing. Perhaps they just simply like to hear the sound of their own voices. Certainly you may have thought your professors may fall into that category on occasion, perhaps even me. They might also be advertising for mates. They could potentially be holding on to territories or signaling territory ownership. Or if you've ever experienced what we call the dawn chorus beginning half an hour to an hour before actual sunrise, you may think that they just have nothing better to do at 4 a.m. If you've ever heard a rooster calling at 3 in the morning, that certainly has probably crossed your mind. So it turns out that there are a number of different functions of this song, in particular the dawn chorus. The dawn chorus is a phenomena that refers to widespread singing that takes place by birds early in the morning, hence the name dawn, and it takes place amongst many different species, particularly in temperate areas, but even in tropical zones we see many different species singing in the hour or so leading up to sunrise and the hour or so after sunrise. So this segment of time is what we refer to as the dawn chorus, and it's a wide variety of different species all singing simultaneously. It tends to be fairly varied. In other words, there will be times when everyone is singing at the same time. There will be other periods of quiet. It ebbs and it flows. But in general, it's a fairly frenetic kind of a song because individuals seem to be singing passionately and as loudly as they possibly can on their individual territories. So for ornithologists and for biologists, this raises a very interesting set of questions. First and foremost, does it have a function, right? Why is it that birds are singing early in the morning when they can't even see in some cases, or is just beginning to become light? There may be some potential benefits to the dawn chorus, and you might sit for a moment and just think about what those potential benefits might be. But if we start to look at this question, we see that there are potential benefits to males as well as to females. And so in this case, potential benefits could include males advertising for potential mates. So in answer to the earlier question, they also could include benefits to males for advertising territory ownership, essentially signaling to neighboring males and to rival males, I'm still here, I still own this territory, stay out of my area. And in fact, we find that when we remove males from territories that they've held and established and they are no longer present on that territory singing, that rival males move in to take ownership of those territory spaces much more quickly than if you use playback or a recording of that of that territory owner. Even if you remove the actual bird and use a recording to replicate the song on that territory owner, then those birds will stay out of that territory for a long period of time, or at least much longer than they would if it were silent altogether. So there are a couple of distinct benefits to males of singing, both in terms of attracting mates, retaining mates, and also holding territories. There are benefits to females potentially as well. and those would include being able to locate males. So females very often return, especially in temperate areas. Females return a week or two after males. Males will return earlier, establish territories, and then females come and will be looking for potential mates. And territory holders are generally the only individuals that a female will select as a mate. And so there's certainly a clear benefit there. There's also benefits to both male and female from singing early in the morning, as it helps to reinforce the pair bond and establish that territory ownership. So once the pairing has occurred, female knows that her mate is alive and is present on the territory and is helping to defend that territory. So those are a few benefits potentially to both males and females of this dawn chorus. And it's a pattern that we see repeated all around the world. In Europe, in North America, in temperate zones around the world, and also to a lesser degree, but still very present, even within the tropics. So that leads us then to another question. Are there risks associated with this particular strategy? And you can probably think of some fairly obvious risks associated with that strategy, including the fact that you're singing very loudly and advertising your presence to potential predators. So that's a key risk. And so what that tells us from an ecological standpoint is that there must be some significant benefits to doing this particular behavior that outweigh the risks potentially of advertising to any predators that are in the area. So the dawn chorus is one of the most recognizable forms of communication and vocalization that we hear in birds. There are many others, and we'll get to those as we go on through this particular unit. Let's start by looking just very briefly at sound. And most of you will be somewhat familiar with this, and those of you that are musicians will probably know far more about sound and perhaps how sound is produced than we're going to cover in this particular unit. But essentially, sound is the function of a vibration of something, and generally vibration of a membrane, as it pertains particularly to birds and mammals and sound production. I know as I'm talking and narrating this lecture, you are hearing the vibration of my vocal cords, and as they compress and move air about, it creates waves of different frequencies and different amplitudes or loudness associated with them, and we then have learned to interpret those particular sounds to mean certain things, words and sentences that we interpret, and our brains have been trained to interpret in particular ways. How quickly that membrane vibrates back and forth is known as the frequency of the sound or the frequency of the wave, and that is measured in units called hertz. And there's additional details about that in your text that you can go ahead and take a look at. But we can measure the frequency of sound, and that tells us about something about the production of that particular sound within not only birds, but also animals in general, including human beings. So sound production in birds functions in a way that is different than most mammals, although it does still at its root include the vibration of a membrane. But it turns out that most birds at least have what's called a syrinx. So rather than having vocal cords, they have a box in their lower throat or upper chest that's called a syrinx, in which we have, so it's sort of analogous to your voice box. And the vibration of the membranes inside the syrinx may be the result of these, what we call super fast. So they contract very, very quickly, much more quickly than the muscles in our voice boxes do. So they contract very quickly and produce a variety of different sounds, some of which we simply cannot produce with that speed, with that degree of muscle contraction. And so as you can see here, reference is a study from 2004 where they looked at the rate of movement of contraction of those muscles, and they found that starling muscles within the syrinx can contract up to 100 times faster than what we find within human vocal cords. So very rapid changes and contractions of the muscle, but we also see contractions of the tissues themselves and of the syrinx, which allows them to change the volume or the space associated with the esophagus. So they can increase and fill it with air and decrease that, which then produces either relatively low-pitched sounds if the esophageal volume is very large, or very high-pitched sounds if the esophageal volume is very small. So birds have the ability to regulate both the volume or the space of the esophagus, as well as the contraction rate of the muscles that are associated with the syrinx, to be able to produce a much wider range of sounds than what a human being could, and certainly most mammals as well. So here you see a slide that just simply diagrams a variety of different frequencies of sounds. You see the optimal range of human sound, which ranges from perhaps around 0 or 1,000 hertz or 1 kilohertz, all the way up to perhaps around 20 kilohertz is sort of the range, or 25 kilohertz is the range for human sound. Across that spectrum of human hearing, you see represented sort of in the center right a variety of different calls and sounds that are made by a variety of different species. So you see that there are some species that produce relatively low pitch sounds, and you have other species, especially the warblers, that produce very high pitched sounds. And so depending on your hearing ability, which is largely dependent upon your age and the abuse that you may have subjected your ears to, you will perhaps not be able to hear some particular kinds of sounds. So for example, as we age and our ears begin to lose some capacity, one of the first things that we often lose is the ability to hear high frequency sounds. So older birders very often have difficulty hearing warblers with their high-pitched calls, but they might still be able to hear sparrows and geese and owls and so forth with much lower pitch sounds. Okay, so second question, or another question then, is where does bird song come from, right? How is it that birds, we know a little bit at this point about how birds actually produce sound, but how are they wired to produce song in the first place? And it turns out that in many of the species, roughly half, right, about 4,600, we have roughly 10,000 species of birds. In most songbirds, roughly half of the overall species of bird, we find that song is actually learned. In other words, it turns out that there's a genetic component. They're hardwired to have a basic song that they begin to express, but the nuances of the song are learned. So it's somewhat analogous to you and I. We might be able to hum a song and maybe stay more or less on pitch and on note, but it's only by hearing that song over and over and practicing that song that we actually can refine it to the point where we can sing that song in a way that's both meaningful and accurate to the original intent of the songwriter. So I know that's probably not a very good analogy, but there's a very strong learned component that goes along with the genetic component of song in most songbirds. So as a result of that, the repertoires of birds can vary quite significantly. Some of them have the ability to learn very extensive songs, or very complicated songs, and others of them have very, very simple songs. So our common black-tipped chickadee that we have here in Minnesota essentially has one song and relatively little variation. So if you listen to a chickadee on campus, and then go and listen to a chickadee in Roseville, and go listen to a chickadee out in eastern Minnesota, along the Hudson area, along the Minnesota River or the St. Croix River, you're going to find very similar types of songs. Chickadee-dee-dee, right? Or, right? Those kinds of calls are going to be consistent no matter where you go. On the other hand, we actually looked at this example earlier in the semester. If you recall, the song sparrow, which is a species that we have here in Minnesota, has actually a fairly complex repertoire, not only of different songs that it might sing within Minnesota, but then as we move around to different parts of the country, we actually see that the song sparrow has a lot of regional variation in the songs that they sing. A couple of other examples you may not be familiar with: marsh wren, fairly complex repertoire of songs. The northern mockingbird has an incredibly complex repertoire of songs, of upwards of 150 different songs that it might sing. Now, scientists have developed some tools to help us to study and understand song, and so the next couple of slides just illustrate how we can use these tools to be able to identify aspects of different songs, including frequency and amplitude. So this the speed of vibration of the different sounds, and then also the strength of those different sounds, how loud they are. And so we can record a song, and then we can run that recording through a digital analyzer and produce something akin to what you see represented on the slide here, which is called a sonogram. And so we see across the x-axis, we see time, and across the y-axis, we have frequency or pitch. And so this allows us to visualize very, very complex songs and also to slow calls down in a way that our hearing simply may not be able to detect differences, right? If we have large changes in pitch or large changes in amplitude, it's possible for us to detect that. If you're a trained musician, you may be able to detect more subtle changes, but many of these changes simply occur too rapidly for the human ear to be able to detect those differences. And so I'm going to post on Moodle an example of a wood thrush song at normal speed, and then that same song slowed down to half speed. And you'll be able to begin to see at that point, if you compare it to the slide, the sonogram here, you'll begin to see those individual components begin to break out as that song is slowed down. Okay, if you just listen to it real time, you don't really hear a lot of that variation. Certainly it's a beautiful song and you hear changes, but they're major changes, not the smaller minor changes that are actually a part of the complexity of the song. So take a moment, whether you do it right now and pause this or whether you come back to it later, but please take a moment to listen to those particular songs that I've posted on Moodle. Here's a couple of other sample sonograms, so you can just see the variety of complexity. So we have things like the red-eyed vireo, which has a very unique and noticeable song. And in fact, birders very often associate different words with particular bird calls to be able to remember them a little bit easier. So in the case of a red-eyed vireo, a component of it, it's repeated over and over. Their song sounds somewhat like, here I am, see me, here I am, see me. And hopefully later on this spring, we'll hear red-eyed vireos singing, and you can listen for that particular call. Common yellowthroat, which is a very common species in Minnesota also, we'll find them on campus. We'll have a call. The male sounds somewhat like witchity, witchity, wit, witchity, witchity, wit, and so forth. So you can see how those break out with sonograms. Take a moment to just look at the differences and recognize that they represent some fairly significant complexities in songs. In some cases, they're a simple pattern repeated over and over, and in other cases, they are a highly variable pattern. We can also use an oscillogram to measure the intensity, or what we call the amplitude, or the loudness, if you will, of that particular song. And so this is just a visual. Again, a lot of these tools are to help us to visualize these complex aspects of songs, allow us to study and look for differences. It allows us to do things like look for regional differences. What are the common core, the common components of a song, and then what are the pieces that may represent variation? So simply, I wanted to introduce you to some of the tools that are used to study the components of song. I'll go ahead and post the link to the brown-headed cowbird as well for you to listen to on Moodle. All right, this brings us to a definition, or a couple of definitions that we need to provide. And you will see in your reading, and you'll hear me talk about songs, and then we need to make the distinction between a song and what is a call. And there is a difference. There's a difference between those two. Songs tend to be longer and more complex, whereas calls are much shorter and are very often used to communicate a very, very different type of information. So we're going to take a little bit of time to look at both of those, and I'll post a couple of example links of those on Moodle as well for you to listen to. So you can see here just simply songs tend to be longer, more complex, and these are very often used very specifically to defend territories and attract mates. Because of that, they're focused usually on a specific time, breeding season, and outside of that time, you don't often hear those types of vocalizations at all. So chickadee is a good example of that locally on campus. Most of the year, all year round, you can hear chickadee giving the very recognizable chickadee-dee-dee call, but only during the breeding season, only during the spring, will you hear chickadees vocalizing with their song, which is the more of a whistling call that we hear and associate with chickadees. Calls, in turn, are fairly brief, simple vocalizations, and they're used to communicate an entirely different set of information than a song, and they can be used for distress. They can be used to signal alarm to their conspecifics or members of the same species in the area, neighbors and mates and so forth. They're also used to indicate flight and a desire to fly. feeding behaviors, flocking behaviors, as well as recognizing individuals and also signaling young and recognizing young. So all of these things are part of the use of calls, a much broader range of functions for calls than we see in song. So there's our black-capped chickadees, and I'll move on from here, but these will be available for you to listen to on Moodle. So what do the two mean, right? We've already touched on that a little bit. Primary function of song is for attracting mates and territory establishment, but then calls can have multiple functions, as I mentioned earlier, identifying differences between species, differences between males and females, identifying individuals. Males will learn to recognize individual territory holders, and they will not only recognize that there is a male or another individual on a territory, but actually who that individual is, in the same way that you learn to recognize your roommates and the people that live on the floor around you and the residence hall around you. You see a list of other functions that are there as well, and I'll try to post some of these links for you to listen to on Moodle. So how do we know this? Well, we know that one of the very important functions of song is to stake out and maintain territories. And so this particular slide illustrates a study with white-throated sparrows where they experimentally removed individuals from established territories and just held them in cages. And when they were simply removed from those particular areas, if they experimentally played back recordings of those individuals who had been previously present, were the territory holders, then we saw a reduction in the number of attempts for individuals, other neighboring individuals, to intrude, right? So if we read this, take a moment to look at this graph and interpret it, but the way it can be interpreted is the controls, which would be the territories where the males were removed but there was no playback that took place, had a much higher rate of intrusions from neighbors than in the territories where males were removed, but they used recordings to simulate the continued presence of those territory holders. And in that case, we had far fewer intrusions that were taking place. So males were still challenging each other from neighboring territories, that's represented by the red bar, the playback bar, but the rate at which they did so was significantly less than when there were no playbacks at all, which suggests that territories are very important, song is very important in maintaining and staking out territories. And this is repeated in other studies as well, so it's not just unique to white-throated sparrows. Turns out that males, because of the very important function of song in attracting mates and retaining territories, that in some species at least, we start to see males using increasingly complex songs as a way of outcompeting each other. And so one possibility, of course, would be for a male just to invent novel song, right, to be a songwriter and to invent something that is completely novel. But in most cases, what we see is that species have an ability to use song mimicry, in other words, to replicate the sounds that they hear in the environment around them, very often different species of birds. But if you recall the video clip on the lyrebird in Australia, it was actually mimicking sounds such as camera shutters and chainsaws and other things in the environment, car alarms, into its own song. So this is something that we see in a lot of different species, and you see some of the examples listed. European marsh warbler imitates 70 different species of European and African birds, and you might ask yourself, how does it imitate African birds when it's a European bird? Well, this particular bird migrates to Africa to winter, and so it picks up components of African bird song and comes back to Europe and then integrates those components into its own repertoire. Brown thrasher, which is a species that we have here in Minnesota, has a repertoire of upwards of 2,000 different songs that it sings. And so you can sit and listen to this bird singing for an hour and you may not hear it repeat the same song twice, because it's just simply singing and incorporating different aspects of cardinal and blue jay and other things into its own repertoire. So starlings, mynas, bowerbirds, which are a species that we find in Australia, mockingbirds, the lyrebird that we saw the video clip on, all of these represent well-known mimics. So we know that males utilize song mimicry and extensive repertoires to attract or establish territories, to stake out and establish territories. It also turns out that females cue in on these more extensive song repertoires in many different species as well. So you see a couple of examples here. The great reed warbler, which is a European bird in Sweden. This particular study showed that females were preferentially picking males that had larger repertoires, not necessarily as their mates, but as their extra pair partners. So as a strategy for increasing the female reproductive success, they'll often mate with multiple males, and they were preferentially choosing males that had larger song repertoires as their potential extra pair partners. There's also seems to be a connection, at least in some species, between males with larger repertoires and the ability to survive longer. Now, that doesn't mean that they're happier because they sing and that they're necessarily healthier, but it may be a reflection of the fact that they are healthier, which allows them to develop larger repertoires. And so there's a connection between the ability to survive, better health, and potentially the ability then to develop these larger repertoires amongst males of some species. So interesting connections. So it may not just be about just the increased repertoire, but there are actual benefits to males for having that, and they may also signal females of their overall health as a result. Another function of vocalizations is the category of things that we call calls, and one of the very important functions of a call is to serve as an alarm call. An alarm call has to fulfill a couple of necessary functions. First of all, it has to be a call that can be heard by individuals who you're trying to warn, because at that point, if you are giving an alarm call, it is for the purpose of warning mates, warning young, maybe warning other individuals in the area that there's a potential threat. And of course, that threat very often is a predator. So you want to be able to give a call that can be heard, but you also want to give a call that is going to be difficult to locate, because you don't want to be the individual that gives the call but then is eaten because the predator can find where you're calling. And so alarm calls tend to have a very distinctive profile when we look at it in a sonogram. And you can see the three different species that are represented here: black-capped chickadee, the tufted titmouse, and the American robin, two of the species that we see here on campus. But you see that regardless of the species, we see a very similar pattern, right? These calls tend to have a very narrow frequency range, relatively high-pitched, and those aspects or those properties of those calls make them very difficult to locate. And so we'll have a chance, hopefully, as we're out this spring, or if you're walking alone, listen for this along Seminary, along the path to Seminary, North Village. You will hear a high-pitched call, very often 30, 40, 50 feet in front of you if you're walking quietly and you're really listening for this. And those high-pitched calls, and if you try to locate them, you'll find that it's very difficult to find. You might find a general area, but to actually pinpoint where that bird is calling from can be very challenging. That's an alarm call. That bird has seen you. It is warning its neighbors as you are coming, and those birds are effectively freezing and waiting and watching. And you'll probably walk by without ever seeing the actual bird. They are there. They very often don't fly off. They may just remain motionless until the threat is passed, but they have seen you long before you ever see them. And so that's part of the reason why, as we get out later on this semester, we want to try to walk quietly, because those birds are going to be seeing you long before you ever have a chance to see them. And they will be telling their neighbors and their conspecifics that you are coming, which will cause the rest of the birds to sit quietly and you potentially to miss them. Alarm calls can be very complex, and the chickadee is a great example of this, something that we think of as being a relatively simple call, simple vocalization with little complexity, turns out can be used to communicate some very complex information. And a study that was done, that's illustrated here on the right-hand side of this graph, showed very nicely that chickadee calls are associated with the kind of predator and the perceived threat from those particular predators. So across the bottom, you see a rough measure of different avian predator sizes, and you may or may not recognize some of these names, things like great horned owls, great gray owls we've talked about already in class. These are big, large owls that move relatively slowly compared to the chickadee. So for a chickadee, these do not represent much in the way of threats. In contrast, smaller birds like Cooper's hawks and kestrels, saw-whet owls, pygmy owls, things that are small and move quickly and are potentially able to catch a small, quick chickadee, are much greater threats. And so if you look on the y-axis, you see that the number of D notes, in other words, the D call that you hear a chickadee giving, it turns out that the number of D calls that they give is associated with the perceived threat of the predator. So if a threat is a significant one, you'll hear a chickadee give a call that's chickadee dee dee dee, right? They might give 3 or 4 Ds at the end of that call, or 5 or 6. If it's a threat, maybe like you and I, they don't take very seriously, it might just be chickadee, and it allows them to advertise that there is a threat coming, as well as communicate the degree of severity of that threat as a part of the information. So pretty cool. What you may have not realized as you're listening to that very common call is that they are telling their neighbors all about you, and the fact that they probably aren't very concerned about you as you're walking by. So this particular slide just illustrates some of the variety of different types of calls. So we see robin and song thrush, great tit, which is European. Song thrush and great tit are European. These are all European birds. This is a European robin, not the American robin. But all of these calls have a similar signature. They're all relatively high frequency calls, relatively simple or narrow range of frequencies, which makes these calls very, very difficult to locate. Even chickens, something that we don't think of as being a very intelligent bird or having a very sophisticated repertoire of calls and vocalizations, turns out that they do communicate information with our alarm calls. So on the top you can see the call that is given by a chicken in response to an aerial predator, and below you see the different call that is given in response to a ground predator. So these two types of predators require a different kind of a response potentially, as well as different degrees of threats, and something as simple as a chicken actually communicates information to their social group very effectively. All right, this is not quite in line with what we're talking about in terms of vocalizations, but it's interesting as a corollary. There are a number of different species of birds that have unusual partnerships, sometimes with other birds and sometimes with mammals. I've mentioned this in class a while back, but this particular example is the red-breasted goose and the peregrine falcon. We also see geese partnering with snowy owls, rough-legged hawks, things that are typically predators, especially on young geese. But the thing about these predators, things like peregrine falcons, snowy owls, and rough-legged hawks, is they have the ability to drive away Arctic foxes. And Arctic foxes are major predators on not only goose nests, but also potentially on those raptor nests. So raptors will be very aggressive in defending their nest areas from foxes. So they'll tend to clear out foxes within an area of 200 to 300 meters of the vicinity of their nest. So what happens is a goose will nest in the vicinity of a raptor, which is potentially a problem a little bit later on. The raptors won't take an adult goose, but they certainly would take, if the opportunity presented itself, they would take a gosling, as you can see pictured here in the lower right. But in exchange for sort of providing that service, if you will, of protection, what the goose does is provide alarm calls. So the geese remain very vigilant, and they will warn, they will give out alarm calls, which are then interpreted by the raptors, and the raptors in turn respond and chase off any potential predators. So this is a partnership that works quite well throughout the nesting period, so efficiently that you can see that in this particular study by Quinn and Kokarev in 2002, a nest that was located within 20 meters of a peregrine falcon nest or a raptor nest was never predated, right? So the geese were very well protected if they were within maybe 20 to 30 meters of the raptor nest. However, the risk to the goose comes when those eggs hatch, because when those eggs hatch, the goslings represent potential food for those raptors. And so very often what you will see is that on the day of hatch, they will then try to sneak away and lead the goslings away from the danger of the raptor. Raptors very often will attack. The adult geese will try to defend the young. Many times they're successful, but also some of the time the raptors may in fact successfully grab one of the goslings. So it's not entirely a friendly partnership, but it is an interesting partnership because of the alarm calls, the service that's provided by the goose in exchange for protection.